Hello everyone, greetings from sunny Athens. The mercury has surpassed 30 degrees here today, and welcome to another online seminar brought to you by the Greek community of Melbourne. There's no need to tell you how great this city is. Most of you probably know that already, and have probably spent considerable time here in the past. And after almost 2.5 years of lockdowns, I'm sure you're waiting to get reacquainted with Greece. Today's seminar is our annual Battle of Crete commemoration seminar to honour the Commonwealth and Greek soldiers and civilians who were killed, captured or wounded in defending Greece against the juggernaut that was the Nazi German war machine. To give you some basic stats on the intensity of the Battle of Crete, more than 1,700 British, Commonwealth and Greek soldiers were killed and 15,000 captured during the Battle of Crete. Furthermore, more than 6,000 Germans were killed or wounded, while the Luftwaffe lost more than 350 aircraft. And to deliver tonight's seminar, we are honoured to have with us Professor Peter Monteath from Flinders University in South Australia. We'd also like to thank the sponsors of tonight's seminar, the Cretan Federation of Australia and New Zealand, and invite you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice. It's only a tax-deductible $100 donation. Furthermore, let me update you on a programming change for next week's 2nd of June Thursday seminar. It will not be delivered by Sakis Gekas on the Greek financial crisis as originally planned. This seminar will be pushed back to 2023. Nicholas Demanis from the University of New South Wales will be speaking on the destruction of Smyrna, an age of nation building and violence. Professor Demanis should be well known to many of you as he has presented our series in the past. And just a reminder for those that will have any questions during our Q&A interval, simply submit them through the chat or comment section on Facebook or YouTube. The Battle of 42nd Street is the focus of tonight's seminar. It's one of the bloodiest battles involving Australian forces in the Second World War. 42nd Street, just south of Crete's Suda Bay, was a defensive line where both Australian and New Zealand troops were stationed. Our speaker tonight has also released a book on this battle and will also be sharing its details should anyone want to further investigate the topic. A bit of background on our speaker tonight. He was born in Brisbane and educated in Queensland and in Germany. His specialisation and research interests are in the area of modern European and Australian history. He has taught previously almost in every state in Australia but Tasmania, the University of Queensland, Griffith University, Deakin University, University of WA and the University of Adelaide. He's also been an adjunct professor at the University of St. Louis, Missouri and the Technical University of Berlin, where he was an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow. At Flinders, he is currently Vice President and Executive Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. He has published numerous books over his academic career. Two of his notable ones are POW, Australian Prisoners of War in Hitler's Reich, and Red Professor, The Cold War Life of Fred Rose. Enough for me. I pass on the baton to Professor Monteath.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks everyone for being there. Particular thanks to the Cretan Federation of Australia and New Zealand for sponsoring the event. I'm particularly indebted to Nick to think of inviting me to speak to you on this special occasion. It's the 26th of May today, of course, and tomorrow then is the anniversary of this battle. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country, and for you this might seem a rather unusual one. Nyadu Tampanti Ganamiana Yatamatanya Wama Tandanyaku. That means that I acknowledge the Ghana people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains. That applies, of course, where I am this evening. I'm in Adelaide, but let me add then that I acknowledge the traditional owners of all the countries where we are this evening. So as Nick said, I'm the author of a book about 42nd Street, and there it is on the overhead. That came about 3 years ago, published in 2019. The book itself has a bit of a history. I'd first become aware of Crete and the battle for Crete when I did a book about a decade ago about Australian POWs. And my focus in that book was the POWs who were in Germany during the Second World War. And the biggest group of those Australian POWs in Germany were those who had been captured as a result of the war in Crete. There were over 3,000 of them. After I did that book, I did another one where I focused on one particular individual. His name was Johnny Peck. He was a Victorian man, so from your part of the world, and he served in the 2nd 7th Battalion. And he's one of those 3,000 or so captured in Crete soon after the battle for Crete. But he had a very entertaining story in the sense that he, after the battle ended, like many Australians, was on the run in Crete, and he was looked after by Cretan families for quite some time until, unusually, he was eventually captured not in German-occupied Crete, but in the Lasciti province at the eastern end of the island, and he was captured by Italian forces and spent the rest of his war in Italian captivity, at least when he wasn't escaping. That book is called Escape Artist because he was someone who on multiple occasions managed to escape both the Germans and the Italians. It's one of those stories that I think shows the very special connection between Australians and Cretans. I was reminded of that recently when I was told a story about a current minister in the government here in South Australia. His name is Tom Koutsantonis, and he's of Cretan heritage. And the story is that his mother, when she was married in Crete, was wearing a wedding dress which was made from the silk of a German parachute. So those books have taken me to Crete. I've been there twice now. I've seen the battlefields. I've been to the war cemeteries, in particular the Commonwealth Cemetery on Suda Bay that Nick mentioned before. I've been to Sfakia, that evacuation point. And I've gone in the footsteps, so to speak, of people like Johnny Peck. But when I was working on the Peck book, I became aware that he spoke after the war at some length about one particular battle that he was involved in while he was on Crete, and that was this battle at 42nd Street near Suda Bay on the 27th of May 1941. And I wanted to write at more length about that particular battle. My publisher said to me that what they didn't want was another campaign history, because there are lots of really good books about the Battle of Crete, as you will probably be aware, including books by Australians. You know, there's a book by Robert Ewer, you might know, about the war in Greece and Crete. Maria Hill did a book called Diggers and Greeks. An Australian called Albert Palazzo has written a very good history of the Cretan campaign. So this is a war that's attracted lots of historians. And my publisher said, please, not a campaign history, but could you do a book about the battle for Crete that is distinctive in some way? And I would say that what I've tried to do that's distinctive in this book is two things. First of all, I wanted to tell the story not just from an Australian perspective. As Nick said before, my background in good part is not in Greek history, but in German history. I'm an historian of Germany. So I said what I will try to do in writing this history is look at it not just from an Australian point of view, but also from the points of view of others who were involved in that battle. And that meant from a New Zealand point of view, from a Greek point of view, from a British point of view, and above all, from a German point of view. What was it like for those Germans when they encountered, in particular, Australian and New Zealand troops in Crete, and in particular on that fateful day, the 27th of May? The other thing that is distinctive, I think, about what I've tried to do in the book and what I'll try to do in the presentation this evening is I focus on, strangely enough, an aspect of war which is often overlooked, and that is the act of killing. It's a grisly topic, and I might warn that there are a couple of images in my presentation that perhaps aren't suitable for viewing by children. But it seems to me that very often in Australia, when we talk about war, we talk about Australians going overseas to die. And that's true, of course. That's what happened to lots of Australians in this war and in others. But of course, these men were soldiers, and their job was to kill. That's the work of a soldier. And the question that I wanted to ask myself was, what is it that makes men kill? How do men motivate themselves to kill in war? Because it seems to me that that's not something that can be taken for granted. Men don't necessarily kill when placed on the field of battle. And indeed, there are studies of military history that focus on this question. One in particular by an American historian, his name's S.L.A. Marshall, sometimes called Slam Marshall, who during the Second World War did a study of American soldiers and wrote a book called Men Against Fire. And he claimed that fewer than 25%, fewer than a quarter of men in combat actually fired their weapons at the enemy. So when men are in battle, we don't know for certain that they will kill, even when their lives are at risk. So I thought that what I would do by focusing on a particular battle where clearly men did kill, and very successfully, I would ask that question: how did they get themselves in that state of mind that allowed them to do what their job actually required them to do, and that was to kill the enemy? Now, my way into that topic, that psychological dimension of war, was through the bayonet. Because the distinctive thing about this battle on 42nd Street was that it consisted of a bayonet charge. And I look in the book at the history of the bayonet. It goes back centuries. It goes back to the 17th century. And over time, of course, some of the technology of the bayonet had changed. There'd been debates about what was the best kind of bayonet. Should it be a long one? Should it be a short one? There were those who said that it was important to have a long bayonet at the end of the rifle, because the longer it was, the better the opportunity for the soldier to be able to reach the enemy and take advantage of the enemy. By the 20th century and the First World War, Australians were using this bayonet on the image. This is the pattern 1907. And that was the bayonet that was used into the Second World War as well. So Australian infantrymen would have all been issued with this pattern 1907 bayonet. Even though there were many people who were saying in the 20th century, what's the point of a bayonet? And it's an interesting argument. Certainly, if you look at the history of the First World War, there are very few soldiers who were killed by bayonets. Most men killed in war were killed by artillery or by machine gun fire. And yet there were others who said, well, that might be true. The bayonet as a weapon didn't kill many, but it had other advantages. And in particular, it had psychological advantages. Psychological advantages because when an enemy noticed that a soldier was carrying a bayonet, had fixed his bayonet to the end of his rifle, then that was the sort of thing that drove fear into the enemy and persuaded him to turn and run. So there was that psychological effect of the use of the bayonet. But the other psychological effect of the use of the bayonet was on the man who used the bayonet, who fixed the bayonet to his rifle. Because these men had been through the kind of military training which focused on the use of the bayonet as a way to set them into an aggressive state of mind. There was that connection in their mind that once they were told by their commanding officer to fix bayonets, they knew that the situation was very serious. They learned through training to connect that moment and that action of fixing a bayonet to the need to enter into a kind of hyper-aggressive state, to become belligerent, to prepare for battle, and prepare to kill, to be in the kind of mindset that would enable people to do their job, that is to confront the enemy and, where required, to kill. So the bayonet is a really important part of my story, and I was interested in it above all because of that use of the bayonet for above all for psychological purposes. Now, the book is one which we can see there some. These are members, by the way, of the 2nd 7th Battalion. That's the battalion I mentioned before, the one that Johnny Peck was in, the main Australian battalion involved in the war in Crete, and in particular on 42nd Street. And this is a photograph of them. They're doing some training. They have their bayonets fixed, and this is in Egypt just before they were sent to Greece and then on to Crete. So in my book, I tell a broader story. I identify particular people whose fate I want to follow through the Battle of Crete and through 42nd Street. Of course, there are Australians. There's Johnny Peck. There's an Indigenous man of whom you may have heard. His name was Reg Saunders, and he also was an infantryman in the 2nd 7th Battalion. I look at their commanding officer, a Victorian called Theo Walker. I look at some of the New Zealanders. I identify particular individuals, some of them members of the 28 Maori Battalion. Then there's a man called Sandy Thomas who distinguished himself in Crete. So I look at common soldiers, but also commanding officers, and the key commanding officer among the New Zealanders in Crete is Bernard Freiberg, who had overall command of Crete during its defence. I look at some British soldiers who were involved in the war in Crete, but then, as I said before, I also look at Germans. I tried to find accounts by German soldiers of their participation in the war in Crete. So I look at the general who commanded them, a man by the name of Kurt Student, a battalion leader called Hans Forster, one of the parachutists, Baron August von der Heide was his name. All of them left accounts of what it was like from a German perspective to fight in Crete. And so, having identified some of these individuals, what I do then in the book is, first of all, to set the context and talk about the events that led to the invasion of Crete. So you can see there on the overhead, I think you'll be aware that before Crete, there was, of course, a battle on the Greek mainland. The Australian 6th Division, which included the 2nd 7th, had been sent there from North Africa. And for our purposes, there's not a lot to say about the battle for Crete, other than that the Australian experience and the New Zealand experience was an unhappy one. This was an occasion where, as Robert Ewer has pointed out, the Australians and New Zealanders were combined again to form an Anzac corps. And they fought with Greek forces, they fought with British forces. But their experience after the German invasion through Bulgaria and through Yugoslavia from the 6th of April was that they were very quickly overwhelmed, and overwhelmed above all because of the superiority of the Germans in the sky through the Luftwaffe, but also they were overwhelmed by the speed with which the Germans were able to attack. This was a much more mobile war, they were discovering. The Germans here, as earlier in the war, had been using this blitzkrieg strategy, which meant that they were able to surround enemy forces and capture them quickly in great numbers. So where many of the Australians might have thought that the war would be a bit like the First World War, they might be confronting the enemy in hand-to-hand combat in trenches, that wasn't the experience of Greece at all. So what occurred was that the Australians, the New Zealanders and others, they were forced onto the back foot very quickly. They were forced south. By the end of April, they were being evacuated from beaches not far from Athens or across the Corinth Canal from the Peloponnese. And some were sent to Egypt, to Alexandria, but others, the greater part of them, were sent to the island of Crete. Now, many of them were at sea on Anzac Day of that year, the 25th of April. What they wouldn't have known was that that was also the day on which Hitler decided that he would invade Crete as well. That was not a foregone conclusion. The original German operation had been against the mainland. But once it was clear that Germany was going to win a very quick victory there, Hitler had to consider that option of invading Crete as well. And he balanced up the pros and cons of doing so. The cons would be that a war in Crete would be another distraction for him. Remember, this is by now late April, May of 1941. His main interest is in Operation Barbarossa, that is the invasion of the Soviet Union. That's about to start. That will occur in June, so in a matter of weeks. Against that, the sorts of things that pushed him towards an invasion were a sense of the strategic importance of Crete, because to have Crete means domination over the Eastern Mediterranean. It means having a line of supply to North Africa, and by this time, of course, Rommel and his Africa Corps are in North Africa, so that's a reason why it might be good to take Crete as well, if possible. And also thinking ahead to Barbarossa, it would be useful if Crete were occupied to protect that southern flank, and above all to stop the Allies being able to access the oil fields of Romania. So on balance, the Germans and Hitler decided that Crete should be invaded. But the plan for that invasion was largely the work of a man I mentioned earlier, Kurt Student, who was an experienced soldier. He had fought in the First World War, but he was someone who was fascinated by the technology of flight. And in particular, he was interested in parachute war. And it was Student who came up with this plan of staging an invasion of Crete almost entirely from the air. So his plan was that German forces would be flown into Crete. The work was left largely to parachutists and to assault troops. The best way to explain the plan, I think, is to show you this map of Crete, which gives you some sense of where the Germans sought to stage their invasion and how they sought to do it. And at the same time, it tells you a little bit about how the Allies under Freiberg's command tried to defend the island. The key thing for the Germans was that to stage a successful invasion, they needed to claim an airfield. And there were 3 airfields available to them. One was at Malomé, which is on the western end of the island, on the north coast there. Then more centrally, near Retamo, there was an airfield. And then further to the east, in Heraklion, or just outside Heraklion, there was an airfield as well. The plan was that parachutists would take at least one of those airfields, and once an airfield was claimed, then German planes would be able to bring in more troops. Mountain troops was what was envisaged after the initial landing by parachutists. What would follow in time would be that other mountain troops would be delivered by two relatively small flotillas. That is, they would arrive by sea. But the key thing, the crucial component of Student's plan was this invasion from the air. The weakness of the plan was that if he failed to gain even one of those airfields, then all was lost. The Allies, from their perspective, knew that this was the thinking that the Germans were concocting. They had very good intelligence, and they knew that to defend themselves against an invasion, they needed, above all, to defend those three airfields. And you get a sense from this map of where Freiburg disposed his forces, and there were considerable numbers of them. You can see there on the map the strengths of the respective forces. Something like 7,700 New Zealanders, 6,500 Australians, and then British Greek forces as well. Overall, something over 40,000 troops against a smaller but very potent force of Germans. One of the weaknesses of Freiburg's approach, though, was that he decided he did need to commit some of his resources to defending the beaches along the north coast of Crete, and arguably made an error in committing more forces than he should have to the seaborne invasion, when really the crucial point was the planned airborne invasion. So how did this battle for Crete unfold? The battle began on the 20th of May. These are some of those German paratroops preparing on the mainland just before boarding one of their transport planes. I have an image here of one particular German inside one of those transport aircraft. I don't know whether you can recognize who this man is. It's the boxer Max Schmeling, a former heavyweight world champion, and one of the better known of the members of Student's paratroop force. And these men were dropped onto Crete on the 20th of May. There was a first wave of paratroops in the morning of that day, early morning, and then there were later waves in the afternoon. The early morning attack was around Malomé and Chania and Suda Bay. And what the Germans found was that they received a very hostile reception because the Allies were better prepared than the Germans had thought. There were more of them than the Germans had thought. The Allied forces had been well camouflaged. The German intelligence, unlike the Allied intelligence, was poor. And so there are many accounts of how this first phase of the battle for Crete unfolded from the Allied perspective, a bit like a duck shoot. They noticed these paratroops jumping from aeroplanes and their parachutes billowing. But in that crucial time between exiting the aircraft and landing, many of those men were shot. The Allies were waiting for them. There were others who arrived by glider, but large numbers of those gliders were forced into areas where they landed very awkwardly. They were shot at even while still in the air. There were lots of cases where men aboard those gliders were dead even before the gliders landed. I'll come to this one in a little bit, though. I think in summary, that first day didn't unfold as the Germans had expected. But one thing did go right for them, and that was that late in the evening of the 20th of May, they were able to gain control of the hill which was overlooking the Maleme airfield. The airfield had been stubbornly defended all through the day, but in the night, indeed into the early hours of the morning of the 21st, the New Zealanders who were controlling that territory, that hill 107 overlooking the Maleme airport, made the fateful decision to evacuate that hill. And really that's the turning point in the battle for Crete, that decision to vacate hill 107 and allow from the very next morning the Germans to occupy the area around the airfield, and thereby allowing German aircraft from that second day of the battle to land on Crete and to bring those mountain troops onto the island. And from that point, arguably, the battle for Crete was decided, even if there was still much fighting to come. The outcome was clear, because with that one airfield, even as they couldn't control the two other airfields, with that one airfield in the west, they would, over time, eventually be able to secure the upper hand. Now, the Allies realised that was a crucial loss, the loss of Maleme, the loss of control over the airfield. And there was a concerted effort to retake it, and that was staged in the following evening. Among those forces trying very hard to reclaim the airfield was the Maori battalion. And with the Maori battalion, another of the New Zealand battalions. And the image that I have there on the slide is one that I found in the New Zealand archives, and it's a scene from this effort to retake the airfield at Maleme. And it shows that at this point already, the New Zealanders are making use of the bayonet. They're finding that unlike on the mainland, this war in Crete is different, because the nature of this war, with paratroops dropping among them, is such that they have this opportunity for close hand-to-hand combat. They have opportunities for the use of the bayonet in ways that they didn't have during the battle for the mainland. And so this is from a diary, an illustrated diary by F.W. Carr, and he shows this use of the bayonet in a movement that was known as the throat jab. Nonetheless, despite those efforts to reclaim Maleme, they did not succeed. The airfield was lost. And over time, what occurred was that the Germans, sure enough, they pushed their way against stubborn resistance, but bit by bit, they made their way further towards the east. They took eventually the town of Galatas after some very bitter fighting and after a bayonet charge by New Zealand forces. And from Galatas, the way was open then to Chania, towards Suda Bay. And as they moved further and further to the east, the Allied forces, Australians, New Zealanders, they pushed back. And late on the night of the 26th of May, so at this time, all those years ago, they reached this defensive line called 42nd Street. It's an unusual name. It had been named, or given this English name, by a unit of British field engineers. They were the 42nd Field Engineers, and they had been on this site near Suda Bay in October 1940, but they had since left. Nonetheless, on Allied maps, the name 42nd Street had been preserved. And this was another case where the defence of a particular position gave the Allies, in this instance, above all Australians and New Zealanders, the opportunity to conduct war at very close quarters. The Allies fell back to this line in a condition of exhaustion. They had been on half rations for quite some time. Understandably, their morale was challenged because they were being pushed back day after day. And they knew that they were quite exposed to German forces, including fresh German forces who were arriving with every passing day. When they first reached this defensive line, initially some of them were straddling the line. They didn't recognise the level of danger. They didn't recognise that German forces were approaching them from the west. But as day broke, they pulled back to the road itself. This was a sunken dirt road, but it had an embankment running along the western side of it. So it was quite a useful defensive line. They pulled back. There was a lack of clarity about who exactly was in charge now of these Allied forces, Australian and New Zealand. And so on this morning, a lot of the initiative was taken by the battalion commanders. And that meant the commanders of the two Australian battalions, the 2nd 8th and the 2nd 7th, both of them Victorian battalions. And then also by the battalion commanders of the New Zealand battalions, the most important of which and the freshest of which was the 28 Maori Battalion. So they settled on this line, and between themselves they decided, recognising of course that the Germans must surely arrive at some point, that when contact was made, they would fight back. And that's exactly what happened on the morning of the 27th. There was a German battalion, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Mountain Regiment. And these men had only just arrived the previous day. Their morale was no doubt very high. Their sense was that the battle was unfolding very favourably for them. The disadvantage for them was that on this territory, which was flat but rich in farmland, there were orchards, there were vineyards, visibility was poor. So it was going to be difficult for them to identify the enemy positions. But they would have sent forward scouts to find out where exactly the enemy were. And at some point, contact was made. And in my book, I have two separate chapters about this. One is devoted to what the Australians did and how the Australians reacted. And the other is largely about the New Zealanders. And I must say there's some difference of view as to whether the Australians made contact first or whether the New Zealanders, the Maori Battalion, made contact first. In any case, what's evident from the accounts that come from these men is that they counterattacked very quickly. They fixed their bayonets if they weren't already fixed, and they conducted a charge which drove the Germans back and killed large numbers of them. I might read you just a little bit of an account given by a member of the 2nd 7th Battalion. That's one of the Australian ones. His name was Frank Reiter. And he describes it like this. He said, "I took the whole platoon out with the orders that if we had contact, then we were to start fighting. And the rest of the battalion would come over and help us out, because after being bombed all around Greece and that, We were really browned off with the Germans and wanted to close in on them. Well, we got to this food dump because rations had been really short. We're thinking of having a feed, and one of the boys spotted Germans on the other end doing the same. When we struck these Germans there, we forgot about the feed. So it was on for young and old, because all we were doing that time being bombed, for a month and knocked around, all we wanted to do was get even with them. That was all we were thinking of. And from then on, it was on. So there's this sign that quite spontaneously, the Australians in the 2nd 7th Battalion charged the Germans with their bayonets fixed. It's quite interesting how he talks about the experience of the mainland, where they didn't have these opportunities to confront the Germans face to face. But here it was different. And then I'll read you a little bit of an account by Reg Saunders. That's the Indigenous man who was a member of the 2nd 7th. He wrote after the war, "When Jerry saw us coming and someone gave a yell to give himself more courage, everyone took it up. Before you could say it, we were bolting along, screeching at the tops of our voices. It was crazy, crazy, the most thrilling few minutes of my life. We were all obsessed with this mad race to slaughter with the bayonet. It wasn't like killing kangaroos anymore. When we got close, they were real men, excited like us, and some of them terribly frightened. They were highly trained Germans, but they got such a shock at our din and the way we ran that they forgot they were supermen and ran, the whole 400 of them. We used our knees and rifle butts in our blades. For a while, we stopped being ordinary blokes and became bloodlusted creatures." And then, as a final example of how this bloodlust manifested itself, this is from Johnny Peck. "They didn't just turn and run, they fought back. You have to be ferocious. Come on, you bastards, let's have a go at you. I got a bayonet through the arm. Hand-to-hand combat was very frightening. You know without a shadow of a doubt that if you make a fraction of a mistake, then you're dead. The German knew it and I knew it. It wasn't a question of put up your hands. No quarter was asked or given. You're dead or you're alive. And if you're alive, you move to the next one. He was fairly big, bigger than me, and he got me through the arm, but he was dead very soon afterwards. The German bayonets were nowhere near as long as ours. Ours were 18 inches long. I never felt anything, not even relief." So that was they're quite insightful descriptions into the kind of state of mind with which the Australians became involved in this battle. And the descriptions that are given by the New Zealanders are very similar. An interesting aspect of it is the role of the Maori battalion. And there are accounts of the Maoris performing haka quite spontaneously as a way of working themselves into this kind of aggressive state so that they could go on this charge and kill the Germans they confronted, whether with machine guns or rifle or bayonet in many cases. So it has to be said that this battle, this victory that left 124 Germans dead, it didn't change the course of the battle for Crete, of course. It slowed down the German advance, and that had some advantage to the Allies because by now they were being committed to a retreat and to evacuation. But it did show the Allies that they could defeat the Germans if confronting them in hand-to-hand combat. They were convinced that they could emerge victorious. And it did come at a cost to those Germans. I have there the image of the commanding officer of that battalion that was taken by surprise. His name is Hans Forster. And it's clear that after this event, he was so traumatized, he never became involved in combat again. He basically was assigned to a desk job for the rest of the war. The Germans undertook investigations. They wanted to know what had gone wrong. The next day, they surveyed the field of battle. They made allegations about the behaviour of the New Zealand and Australian troops. They noticed that On the battlefield the next day, there were no wounded. Everyone was dead. They made allegations that what the Australians and New Zealanders had done was, in the immediate wake of battle, to kill them. They noticed lots of puncture wounds, and they would have, of course, been caused by bayonet. They noticed lots of crushed skulls. They noticed that a lot of the gunshots were to the heart, and their allegation was that these were wounds committed after the battle itself, and they expressed their discontent to the Allied forces afterwards. But the Allied response was that the bayonet is a perfectly legitimate instrument of war, weapon of war, and one shouldn't be surprised that after a battle of that nature, one would find puncture wounds on the bodies of dead soldiers. This is one of the images that I was given by Dimitris Skatsilakis, a Cretan military historian who had a collection of photographs, and this is one of those images of German bodies in the immediate wake of battle, strewn across the battlefield. So as I move to a conclusion, I don't want to give the sense that this kind of killing is the only kind of killing that happened during the battle for Crete, or the only kind of killing that exists in war. And indeed, the result of this battle and of the very heavy losses that Germans incurred through the Battle of Crete was a commitment to reprisals. And I wanted to give just one example of that. I'm sure that many of you will be aware that the German occupation of Crete was quite a brutal, a barbaric one. And in the wake of these battles, like the Battle of 42nd Street, in the wake of the killing of all of those German paratroopers and mountain soldiers, there was, with that experience fresh in mind, a strong German desire to punish the people of Crete. And that punishment began very soon after the battle had finished. And one of the notorious early incidents, not of killing in the heat of battle, but killing in cold blood afterwards, and therefore, in my view, quite a different form of warfare, occurred at the village of Condamari, which was not far from the Malmö airfield. And the German accusation was that in that first assault on the airfield, the villagers from Condamari had played some role in the killing of these invading German forces. And a German photographer by the name of Peter Weixler on the 2nd of June was invited by members of an assault regiment to travel to this little village in the hills behind Malmö. And he was able to record the reprisal, the killing of 23 men from that village as a result of this German reprisal killing, which set the tone then for the German occupation over the years that were to follow. There is to this day a monument at Condamari. There's also a monument on 42nd Street to help us to remember the events of that day in 1941. For those of you who wonder about the fate of the bayonet, after all those questions had been asked about whether there was still a place for it, to this day, military trainers still take the view that there is a role for the bayonet. There have been bayonet charges in the Falklands War, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and you'll often see peacekeeping forces even operating with mounted bayonets, because to this day they recognise that psychological effect that comes from fixing the bayonet and operating, even in the framework of a high-tech war as we have today, with the use of the spirit of the bayonet. And with that, I'll finish my presentation, and I'm happy, of course, to invite questions or comments.
Thank you, Peter. That was quite a fascinating presentation. I myself have quite a few questions to ask you before the questions start coming from the floor and from our listeners. Did the Allies ever consider destroying the airports? Because if you make them unusable, that's potentially another option as well by doing was that something considered by the Allied planners?
It wasn't seriously considered at the time, but it's a fair point, and it's a point that historians have made, because there was some use of the airfields by Allied forces, but those Allied aircraft had been withdrawn before the German invasion. So the point was made, if not destroyed, then at least rendered unusable. You could have put large rocks or concrete blocks on them to prevent German landings on the airfields. So it's one of those points that have been made with the benefit of hindsight about what might have been done differently to prevent the German invasion, because really the airfields were the crucial thing, and it might not have been that difficult to render them unusable.
Look, what the question is, were the Allies under-resourced? Because if they were there in Crete before the Germans, could they have had artillery pieces in place, mortars in place, and mined the airport, mined the ports and so forth? Or there's too little too late?
And another fair point, and one that historians have made, because the British had been there for some time. When Italy invaded Greece through Albania, the British had acted to put a garrison on Crete, thinking that the Italians at that time might have tried to go further. So there had been British forces there. That's why those 42nd Engineers were near Suda Bay. So over those months, efforts might have been made to improve infrastructure, for example. One thing that was suggested was that they might have improved port facilities on the southern coast of the island, because one of the difficulties they had was supplying the island from the south. And the trouble with Suda Bay was that it was very exposed to the Luftwaffe. The communications on the island were extremely poor, and that was another area where more work might have been done in the meantime, had they thought ahead about the possibility of an invasion of Crete. But I think the issue was that just wasn't a strategic priority at the time. Allied resources were stretched. Rommel was in North Africa. It wasn't at all clear that Crete would be invaded. So it was one of those areas where, with the benefit of hindsight, you'd say there's so much more that could have been done. There was some artillery there. There were some tanks there, but the artillery set up at the airports, especially at Malmö, was pointing in the wrong direction, or the Germans were cunning enough to approach not from the north, but that they flew around and approached from the west. And by the time they were directly over the airport, there was little that heavy artillery could do. Tanks too they were useful to some extent, but there were so few of them that they couldn't make any meaningful difference to the course of the battle.
And out of the three airports, would you say that Malmö was probably the preferred airport that the Germans would want to have captured? And were the troops sort of stationed in the right proportions when most at Malmö at the time? And was that an issue at all? Or?
It was. So Studen's early thinking was that Malmö was definitely the one to take, and that was why there was more of a focus on that end of the island. That's why the first wave of attack was focused around Malomé and Suda Bay. It was the airfield in the best condition. The others were airstrips, but not much more. They would have sufficed, but Malomé was the preference. It was close to the capital, Kanya. It was quite close to Suda Bay. And the mistake, I think, or one of the mistakes on the part of the Allies was that they did have forces on Hill 107 overlooking Malomé, but just to the west of Malomé there's a river, the Tavranitas, and they didn't dispose any forces to the west of the river, and that's where a lot of the successful landings took place, which eventually enabled the Germans to cross the river and to occupy the airfield. So that's another error, arguably, in the way that Freyberg went about disposing his troops. And then of the Australians, a lot of the Australians were around Retamo, and they did really well in preventing the Germans taking the Retamo airfield. That was especially the 2nd, 1st and 2nd, 11th, I think, so Western Australians and New South Welshmen. But the 2nd, 7th and 2nd, 8th, they were at a place called Georgopoli, and their job was to watch the beach in case Germans arrived by sea, but they were completely wasted there because the Germans didn't arrive by sea. To be fair, not for want of trying, because there were these flotillas, but the flotillas were intercepted by the Royal Navy and never arrived. So the 2nd, 7th and 2nd, 8th, both of them battalions with fighting experience, not only in Greece but in North Africa, would have been much better disposed around an airfield rather than on a beach where no one was going to arrive anyway.
And also the use of gliders instead of transport aircraft. Is that just a question of cost, or what was their competitive advantage?
Yeah, so the thing about the gliders was that the Germans, after the First World War and in the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, they weren't permitted to maintain or develop an air force. So they weren't permitted to have offensive weaponry. But gliders were an exception. So they developed gliders, they developed glider technology. And so they had very advanced glider technology. They had a lot of experience with gliders. They were a little bit cumbersome. The advantage of being in a glider, if you're a soldier, is that when you land, you exit the glider fully armed. Whereas if you're a parachutist, the way the parachutists worked was that they were lightly armed. They had a knife, they had a pistol, but only a few of them had machine guns. And their task, once they hit the ground, was to go in search of a weapons canister. So these canisters containing weapons, they were also dropped by parachute. So the parachutists had to then, after they landed, if they landed safely, go in search of these color-coded canisters to find their weapons, and then they would be ready to fight. So the gliders weren't necessarily a bad idea, but Crete, as all people who've been to Crete will know, is extremely rocky, and it was extremely difficult to get a smooth landing, so that many of these gliders broke up. Many of the occupants were killed on impact, and because they were very lightweight, they were very vulnerable too. That people were shot through the sides of the gliders.
There would have been one-use gliders, and so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But that was the idea, and I mean, they were. It was an amazing piece of technology. There were cases, a transport aircraft could tow more than one glider, and that was quite an achievement to do what they did. But yes, they were one-use machines, but they could deliver 10 men each to the battlefield, and if piloted skillfully, they could be brought precisely to the point where they were most needed. That was the thinking behind it. And their approach too was very silent. There's something in the descriptions of the arrival of the gliders that there wasn't the buzz of an engine that you would expect with an aeroplane. There was something a bit ghostly about these things appearing in the early hours of the morning on the 20th of May.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got a question here from Theo Busnidis. Anthony Beaver, in his book Battle of Crete, was scathing of Freyberg, the Allied commander. He had ultra intelligence and didn't use it. What do you think of his conduct?
Yeah, look, I think that's a very good question, and I think there is good reason to be critical of Freyberg. He was he's a very brave man. He had a VC. He'd served in the First World War, but my view is that he didn't distinguish himself particularly in the way he prepared Crete's defences in 1941. He did have access to this intelligence, so he had a good sense of when the attack would take place. He had a good sense of what kind of attack it would be. It is the case that there was to be a seaborne component to this attack, so you can understand why he might have disposed some of his forces along the coast. But I think it's certainly true to say that he failed in protecting Malomé in particular. The other thing that might be said is with Ultra, it was an awkward thing because it was really important to protect Ultra. They didn't want the Germans to know that they had these decodes of German traffic. And so they didn't want to use Ultra in such a way that would lead the Germans to think, oh, they've discovered what we're up to. And so there was a bit of a balancing act in the way that that Ultra was used.
Got a question here from Costas. It's also on the chat there. Does the bayonet length also put a bit of a psychological distance between the wielder and the person on the receiving end?
Yeah.
If so, what would be the limits of this length of the bayonet? And he's thinking of the Saros weapon of the Macedonian phalanxes. That's what comes to his mind.
Yeah. So there was this debate in the late 19th century. It was the reach debate. And the question was it good to have a very long bayonet because you would have that distance there? I'm not sure whether that was so much a psychological thing as a physical thing. I suppose it's a bit like if you're a boxer, there's an advantage in having a very long reach. And the thinking was that if you had a very long bayonet on the end of a very long rifle, then that would give you that advantage of reach over your opponent. But against that, in the First World War, where bayonets were used quite a lot in trenches, length was a disadvantage because within the confines of a trench, it was very difficult to wield a rifle which had a fixed bayonet. And a lot of the troops reported favouring other kinds of weapons like clubs in close combat, or knives, because the length of the bayonet in those circumstances they found could be a disadvantage. And if you look at the modern bayonets on modern automatic weapons, when they're fixed, they're really quite short bayonets. So that reach argument has pretty much disappeared from thinking about bayonets.
And Peter, the other two airfields, how did they fall? By the parachuters that continued to come, or the German troops didn't arrive overland?
Yeah, so they weren't taken in those initial attacks on the 20th in the afternoon. It was largely those Australians at Retamo and then British forces at Heraklion who fought to a kind of a stalemate. And so the way that was ultimately resolved was through those German forces landing in Malomé, eventually making their way eastward along the coast until they came first of all to Retamo, where it was quite interesting. There were those two Australian battalions. One of the commanding officers, the commanding officer of the of the 1st Battalion surrendered and all his men went into captivity. That was Ian Campbell, and then the other battalion commander was a civilian by background from Western Australia, Ray Sandover. And before the Germans arrived, he said to his men, look, if you want to, let's head off into the hills and see if we can find a way off the island and evade capture. So his men fled into the hills, and they were well represented among the men who were looked after by Cretan families, and in many cases were able to get off the island through Greek or British submarine or through trawlers a bit later, but only because they were looked after by Cretan families. And then in Heraklion as well, eventually those German mountain troops, they made their way as far as Heraklion, and most of the defending troops had been evacuated by then, so a lot of the evacuations took place from Heraklion harbour. And then anyone who'd been fighting at the other end of the island around Suda Bay, Malame, they made their way across the island to Sfakia and were evacuated, if they were lucky enough, from Sfakia. The 2nd 7th, unfortunately, was assigned rearguard duties, and most of those men from the 2nd 7th, fighting to the bitter end, were captured.
Okay, thanks for that. I don't think we have any further questions on the line. Let's bring proceedings to a close. Thanks for your time, Peter. Hopefully, I might just ask just one more question that's going to come in from Georgia. Do you believe anything has changed in relation to the will to kill in recent wars?
Yeah, nice question. Look, I think fundamentally probably not, but I think not in relation to will, but in relation to the sort of training that men do. And so to pick up the point about that historian theorist Marshall, who said, the problem is that lots of men, and he was talking about American soldiers, didn't kill, refused to use their rifles. The armies have learned lessons from that and have found different ways to do training, so that, for example, if you do target training with the rifle, in the olden days you'd use a standard kind of bullseye target, and they thought that a better way to prepare men for the reality of having to kill other men, the way to train them was to present them targets in human form, so in the shape of human beings. So I think through the experience of the Second World War, those sorts of lessons were learned that related to the importance of the kind of training that meant that when men did find themselves in actual combat, as opposed to training situations, they were better conditioned to do what they would be required to do in those circumstances.
Okay. Thanks for your time once again, Peter. Hopefully next time we'll be in Melbourne at the Greek Centre. Thanks once again. Best of luck with your further research and writing even more books. And just a reminder for those who've been following us, we have posted a link to Peter's book on 42nd Street. It can be purchased from a variety of bookshops as well. Definitely a good read. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
A reminder, next week's seminar on the distraction of Smyrna by Nikos Damanis. Hope to see you all next week too.